Hi and welcome to my OCR A-level biology revision session with me, Christine. So today's lesson I want to look at speciation, which is part of your module 6 topic. So Charles Darwin visited the Galapagos Islands in the 1820s, and the organisms that were living there provided Darwin with evidence that helped him develop his theory of evolution by natural selection. So they may give you a graph that looks like this, and they may tell you that by comparing the anatomy between species, such as beak sizes in the finches, can be used to provide evidence to support this theory of evolution by natural selection. So what is natural selection again? Well, natural selection is where there's an increasing in the frequency of the characteristics that make individuals better adapted and decreasing the frequency of other characteristics, leading to changes within the species. So we go back to our keywords. Mutations occur. Those mutations cause variations. There is some form of selective pressure, whether that be the food sources that are available, whether that be competitors, whether that be predators, disease, whatever that selective pressure is. Those that are better adapted are going to survive. Because they survive, they can reproduce, and those alleles with those characteristics will be passed on. So speciation then is the formation of a new species through the process of evolution. So evolution is the cumulative change over time in the inherited characteristics of a population. So there's a number of events that need to happen for speciation to occur. So the first thing that needs to happen is some form of isolation. Now, this could be because of plate tectonics. It could be that there was movement of the land masses that separated the individuals. Now, if they are isolated, they no longer can interbreed. Therefore, there will be no gene flow. So allopatric speciation is the name that we give that occurs when populations are going to occupy different environments. They have been geographically isolated. They are geographically isolated because there may be a mountain range that's in between. It could be a river, it could be sea, it could be something which has caused them to be geographically isolated. It could even be the fact that we have built a road in between what used to be a natural habitat. So allopatric speciation is where we are going to have these populations now occupy different environments. We have geographically isolated them. Now, sympatric speciation is where this occurs when these populations are reproductively isolated, but within the same habitat. So it's more common in plants because plants can form hybrids than it is in animals. Although there are animals that show sympatric speciation, it's not as common as the geographical allopatric speciation. So if I give you an example of plants, then we can take one species of plant. Let's say that they have the chromosomes, which are AA, and we take a closely related species, BB, and we cross them together. Well, what can happen is we can result in a hybrid of these two, and therefore now we have AABB, which originally should have been AA or BB. We now have a hybrid, which is AABB. Now if we cross that with another individual, DD, what we then get is our modern wheat. So we have these hybrids. Now these hybrids are not able to mate with the parents that produced them. So because they're not able to mate with the parents that produced them, they are a new species. So we can see that because we can see that their name has changed. Their binomial naming system is different. Their genus and their species is different from where they originated from, that parental organism. So it's important for you to note that hybrids actually are more common in plants because they can still produce offspring. Those offspring, although they start off as being hybrids, they are able to do a thing that's called genomic doubling. So they can produce more of their chromosomes, which make them able to do this and continue. So that is where modern wheat came from, in the fact that there was this breeding which produced hybrids, and then other breeding which produced other hybrids. And this happens as well with your wild mustard plant. So there are lots of varieties within the wild mustard family, which has given us different plant species. So sympatric speciation is this production of a new species because they have been reproductively isolated, but they are within the same habitat. So after we have got this isolation occurring, there are a few other events that need to happen for this formation of a new species. So we need random mutations to occur. They're in different environments. There's different selective pressures that are going to occur, and therefore different characteristics are going to be selected for or against. We then have these changes in the allele frequency over many generations, which lead to large changes in those phenotypes. And therefore, we get to the point where they are no longer able to interbreed. They are now reproductively isolated. So it's important to note that whether we're talking about allopatric speciation or whether we're talking about sympatric speciation is to do with whether they are geographically isolated or whether they are isolated within the same habitat. However, as the formation of the new species arises, we end up with this reproductive isolation at the end. The fact that they are no longer able to interbreed means that they are now reproductively isolated. So we have this formation of a new species through the process of evolution. And it's to do with this cyclic nature of natural selection, which is going to result in that evolution and speciation occurring. So if they're going to give you a question, it's not going to be as simple as, is this geographical or is this reproductive isolation? That could be a one marker, but what they're more likely going to do with a question is give you an example. So if I were to give you an example of bumblebees, and I told you that there are the early nesting bumblebees and the buff-tailed bumblebees, and I've given you a bit of information that you've got they gather the food between March and September, and they gather their food between May and November. And I've given you information in a graph that tells you that the mean flower depth visited in millimeters for each of these species is presented in my graph. Now, a question that they can ask you would be something like this. Outline how scientists could conclude whether there is a significant difference in the depth of flower visited by these two species of bumblebees. So what they could do is they could have told you these bumblebees evolved and we have new species because of speciation. But what they're actually assessing you on is, do you understand if you're given two mean values for a set of data, how do you figure out whether it's significantly different? And that was where they'd be checking if you know that you would perform a t-test because you want to compare the means of the two sets of data. So this question starts off about speciation, but actually is looking for assessing whether you know how can you conclude on data. And to get a second mark, you always want to talk about, you would be using a p-value of 0.05, which would suggest a significant difference between the two. Now, can I use this graph to figure out and perform a t-test? No, I cannot. Why is that? Because to perform the t-test, I also need to know my standard deviation. So therefore, if I don't know my standard deviation, I cannot perform a t-test. Again, another way in which they could ask you to evaluate whether or not a statistical test could be performed on this data. Now, another thing they could do is ask you to evaluate a student's actual statement that they have concluded. So it's important that you note when you're given information and you're asked to evaluate, you always look for the information which supports the conclusion and the information that does not support it. So they gave you a whole load of information, and therefore they want you to see that there is information that supports. So for example, they feed at different times of year. So with regards to the Bombus pretorum, they are going to feed on their own between March and May. When we look at the Bombus terrestris, that is going to feed only between October and November on its own. So there are some times throughout the year where they are feeding on their own. In that case, we could say that these two species occupy different niches and do not compete, because they do not compete at those times of year. However, we can say that it does not support it because they actually do have feeding times which are similar. Between May and September, they are feeding at the same time. If we want to support it, we could look at the depth, and we could say that they do not feed at the same depth. They have different depths in which they feed at. Therefore, that would show that they do not compete. However, we're not given any information about what time of day do they forage. We're not given any information about the plant species that they are feeding from. So we cannot conclude completely with the information that the student has been provided with and the statement that they have made. So it's really important that you think outside of the information. What else do you need to give a good conclusion? For example, what's their sample size? There's no information on that sample size. So could we conclude on this data? Actually, no, we can't. And also we need to think about the fact that correlation does not mean causation. So it's important that we take in all consideration when we are going to answer any type of question. So I hope you've liked this video, and if you have, then please do click on the like button and subscribe to my channel. And if you haven't already done so, do check out my revision platform, www.aiqchat.com.